History is chock full of evil people that like to take the lives of others, so I figured what better time to talk about this than this Halloween season. This historical serial killer iceberg covers the worst of people from ancient times all the way up through the early 20th century. I've included ancient murderers like old kings and emperors, famous killers like Jack the Ripper, and a bunch of American psychos. We've got those and many more, so let's get started right now. Alright, so in my opinion, there's no way we can start this with anyone other than Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is easily the most infamous serial killer of all time. This was a guy that was active during the end of the 1880s and the beginning of the 1890s. He did his work in the East End of London, England. Now this guy had 5 confirmed victims, but probably more. He had a pattern. All of his victims were women of the night. Now his very first victim was a woman named Mary Ann Nichols. Now Mary Ann had a pretty rough life. She was married and then she had like 5 kids with a guy and then they divorced. She started going down a path of drunkenness and other minor crimes as well as being a lady of the night. During one of these rough nights, Mary Ann was seen walking the streets of London at 2:30 a.m. This would be the last time she was ever seen alive. At 3:40 a.m. on August the 31st of 1888, her dead body was found. Now her body was absolutely mutilated. She was murdered very rough. She was stabbed in the neck. Other parts, you can imagine what I'm talking about here, were beaten up, stabbed. It was rough. This murder began a pattern for the rest of Jack the Ripper's victims. Surgical incisions were made and organs were removed. It was horrifying stuff. One woman's uterus was removed, one woman's left kidney and uterus were removed, and then the last murder was the most gruesome one you could imagine. Everything was removed. Nobody knows exactly who Jack the Ripper was. The criminal profile basically says that it was somebody that knew how to dissect people, like they were probably a surgeon or something like that. It was also somebody that obviously hated women, especially women of the night. I won't go through a suspect list because it's an absolute laundry list of suspects. I could do an entire video on just that. All I know is whoever did this was messed up in the head. H.H. Holmes. Around the same time as Jack the Ripper in the 1890s in America, the same thing was going on with this guy, except it was a lot different. Now the great Dr. Henry Howard Holmes was just an alias for this guy named Herman Webster Mudgett. If my last name was Mudgett, I'd probably change it too. No offense to anybody out there if your last name is Mudgett. Anyway, this guy committed pretty much any crime you could ever think of. Insurance fraud, forgery. He was married to like 4 women at a time. It was some just crazy stuff. Obviously, the worst thing he did was murder. Now, Holmes' greatest MO was the fact that he created a murder castle in Chicago. This murder castle was a 3-story building with dozens of rooms where he committed most of his murders. It had hidden passages, trapdoors, windowless rooms, pretty much every bad guy thing you could think about from like a Scooby-Doo villain, he had it in here. Now, Holmes confessed to over 27 murders, but only 9 can actually be attributed to him. Some of these murders that he confessed to were people that were still living at the time of his confession, so it was just pretty dumb. We know he was a pathological liar because he would literally swindle people all the time. That was his whole thing. He would trick women into thinking that he wanted to marry them and he was very interested in them if their parents had money or if there was something that he could get out of them. As a result, he had like 3 or 4 wives at the same time. So he was a pathological liar, and that's probably why he confessed to so many even though he didn't do that many. Still awful what he did, but he didn't murder like 27 people. Probably. The very worst and most recorded incident of H.H. Holmes' murders was the Pitezel family. Here's how it went. Benjamin Pitezel became the right-hand man of H.H. Holmes in all of his schemes, his criminal undertakings. They cooked up an insurance fraud scam to where somebody was supposed to look like they died or something and the body was going to be found, and as a result they would share $10,000 as a payout. Well, the dead body that was supposed to be part of the fraud was supposed to be just a John Doe cadaver type thing. Instead of doing this, Holmes actually murdered his partner who was cooking up this scheme with him and put his body out there and collected the insurance from that actual murder. That was just the beginning though. This guy had a wife and kids. Holmes then manipulated the wife into giving him custody of some of the kids. He started basically human trafficking them around the country and even into Canada because he had a Toronto apartment or house or something there. He ended up killing the 3 children that were put into his custody. I mean, imagine that. This serial killer killed these poor innocent kids. Eventually, the Pinkertons caught up to him. Literally the Pinkertons from like Red Dead Redemption. He was finally tried and convicted of murder in Philadelphia that year. He was hanged in 1896, and that was the end of America's first serial killer. Just real quick, thank you guys for watching this video so much. You have no idea how much it means to me. If you're enjoying it, hit that subscribe button. It helps me out a ton. And now let's get back to talking about these depraved serial killers. Gilles de Rais. Now, I don't know if I said that right, but this guy was an absolute menace for medieval France. He was a French knight and lord and duke and a whole bunch of other stuff. He was even a companion in arms of Joan of Arc. So this guy probably would have been famous regardless, but now he's infamous because of what he did. This guy from the year 1432 through 1440 had an 8-year reign of terror. That's what they call it in the history books. So what was this guy's favorite type of victim? Children. Now there's not a confirmed number, but at least 140 children were assaulted and other stuff done to them and eventually murdered by this man. He used his high status to lure young boys especially into his household, do all his stuff, and then get rid of them. Our first two entries were bad, but this guy is on a whole other level. It said that this guy was also into necrophilia, so even after these kids died, they were still subjected to these horrors. This guy was apparently also into the occult, so he would literally try to do rituals to summon demons and other horrifying stuff. He was so bad that he confessed to killing his own son and even eating his brain, which is ugh. So how did this guy actually get caught? Well, at the end of this 8-year reign of terror in 1440, this guy was completely out of money. He squandered all of his riches, and this guy was very rich. He was literally a Duke of France. Because he was broke, he sold one of his last castles, and after he sold it, he changed his mind. He decided to storm into the castle that he had already sold. He would hold the owner hostage until he agreed to give it back, and then I don't know what he thought was going to happen after that. Well, obviously, that didn't work. Authorities brought this man forward and obviously put him on trial for this, but also there were tons and tons of rumors about what he was doing with these children. Peasant children from all around his area in France were disappearing, and everybody knew where they were going for the most part. Once there was a reason to get this guy in court and on trial, they went crazy with it. They were going to try to torture him into confessing to all these crimes, but they didn't even have to. He confessed to them himself. In late October of 1440, he was hung and then his body was burned. He was probably okay with this because he was trying to summon demons and the devil and stuff, and that was around, Halloween time, so, there you go. But in all seriousness, this guy was an absolute psycho, and he got what was coming to him. Belle Gunness. Like our first two entries, Belle was active during the late 1880s through the early 1900s, so that time period was just full of serial killers. Belle was a Norwegian-American woman who was active in the Illinois-Indiana area. She was born in Norway, and then she moved to America, and for some reason started killing people. This woman murdered at least 13 people with the possibility of up to 40. This woman was literally a murderer for profit. She would choose her victims based on how much money they had. Alright, so how all this started was she married this guy named Mads Sorensen. They did a little bit of scheming. They owned a candy shop and they owned a house. The candy shop burned down, and not surprisingly, the house also burned down, and they collected insurance checks for the both of them. At some point they had or stole 2 babies, and we'll talk about that in a second, but anyway, these 2 babies both died of large intestine inflammation. Not surprisingly, they had life insurance policies on these 2 babies, so they collected the money off of their deaths. The thing was, nobody ever saw that this woman was pregnant, so maybe she just stole the babies. Nobody really knows about that. Now, Belle and Mads were a good pair of schemers, but even Mads got left out to dry by this woman. He had bought 2 different life insurance policies. His first one would expire after July the 30th of 1900. His second one became active on July the 30th of 1900, so on one day they were both active. That very day, Mads came home from work with a headache. Belle gave him some powder to cure his headache, and he ended up dying. She collected both checks from both of those insurance policies. That's not a coincidence. After that, she had a little bit of money, so she would literally place ads in the newspaper saying that she was a comely widow with some money and wanted to join fortunes with another suitor. Now, as suitors would respond to her newspaper ads, they would literally come out to her farm or her place, whatever. She would try to feed them a meal or whatever, and then she would poison them and take their money. Their bodies would be buried or dismembered or burned, crazy stuff. She had a farm, so she could pretty much do what she wanted. She also married another guy named Peter Gunness, which is where she gets that Gunness last name. She married him in 1902 after her first husband, obviously. So this man, Peter, had an infant daughter who obviously they were going to raise together. I guess his last wife died or or something. The week after Bell married Peter, his infant daughter died of suspicious circumstances. Obviously, this was devastating to him, but 8 months later, he would also die because a meat grinder fell on top of him, or, you know, she killed him. She also collected a life insurance policy on Peter, and then after that, that's when she started calling these suitors in through her ads. With her 2 husbands and those 3 children, that totals 5, but she had like 13 victims that were pretty much confirmed, so she was doing some overtime with these marriage ads. Some of this stuff doesn't even sound real. Like, how did people get away with this stuff whenever they saw that everybody that goes out there just doesn't come back? I don't get it. In 1908, Bell's farmhouse was burned to the ground. Investigators found a headless body that was probably Belle Gunness, as well as the bodies of her children. They also found all these other bodies of these suitors that would come in and then she would kill them, and they found all these graves. They found all this horrible stuff that she'd been doing for the last 20 years. She was never officially caught, and I don't know for sure that that headless body was hers, but everybody assumed it was. What a horrible, horrible woman. The Harp brothers. New day, different shirt, we're here. Joshua and William Harper were a pair of brothers who acted together as serial killers. They were active in the Midwest area of America. Here's the backstory on these 2 brothers. We don't know exactly where they were born. They were either born back in Britain or in America, but they were loyal to the British Crown during the American Revolution. After the Revolution, they decided to become serial killers, I guess because they hated the fact that America won their freedom. I don't really know. They were confirmed to have killed 39 people together, but their body count could be as high as 50 or more. Joshua was known as Big Harp, and William was known as Little Harp. Like I said, after the American Revolution, they started terrorizing Appalachia. I think I said the Midwest earlier, but I really mean Appalachia, like Kentucky, Tennessee area. They started robbing settlers. They would act as river pirates, like they would steal from ships that were on their rivers. It was crazy stuff. And then they started just murdering people straight up. American folklore says that these brothers would disembowel their victims, fill their body cavities with rocks, and sink their bodies to the bottom of the river. They were pretty much just doing this for the love of the game too, because they weren't trying to be like rich, financial gain, all that kind of stuff. They were just killing people to kill people. If you've ever heard the term evil for the sake of being evil, that's what these brothers were. Everybody in America should have known that when they were loyal to the British Crown, but you know, that's none of my business. Alright, here's how evil these brothers really were. They joined a gang of river pirates known as the Mason Gang. The Mason Gang would steal from everybody that came through this little pass or this river or this general area in Appalachia. Even they were appalled at the actions of the Harp brothers. These brothers would lead their future victims to the top of like a cliff, and then they would strip them naked and force them to jump off. If that's not evil, I don't know what is. They were even said to murder people that would offer them shelter, offer them food. The people that were nice to them, they would take them out. They got what was coming to them though. Big Harp was either shot or beheaded in 1799, and Little Harp was eventually captured and hanged in Mississippi. Both of their heads were displayed on stakes as warnings to people to not be like these brothers. Alright, now let's move on to tier 2. Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman who was active at the end of the 16th century, so think like the late 1500s. To me, this kind of seems like the French guy from earlier. They were noble people and they preyed on the lower class. This woman was said to torture and then kill hundreds of girls and women from the years like 1590 to 1610. Her and like 4 of her servants would team up to do this. They would torture and kill these young girls, and there's really no reason why. If there's a torture method that you can think of, she probably did it. She would cut people and just watch them bleed. She would burn people. She would cut their fingers off, mutilate them horribly. She would even do extreme stuff like cover them in honey and send them out in the freezing cold weather so they would freeze, and just, it's awful stuff. Legend has it that she would even bathe in the blood of these girls and women, but that's probably just a tall tale. Although with all this other stuff, I really wouldn't put it past her. Here's the thing about her murders. She was a noblewoman. All of her victims, or at least most of her victims, were the peasants, like the lower class. In the old Hungarian law of this time, this was not illegal. It was looked down upon, sure, because you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to be a decent human being, but it wasn't technically against the law. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, at one point she was bedridden, like she was real sick and couldn't get up. She would have her victims brought in there so she could bite them and do stuff to them right there in her own bed. She would literally offer these girls positions as like servants or maids. They would come in, and that's when they would get tortured and killed by this stupid woman. She was eventually arrested in 1609, and she was basically locked up in a castle for the rest of her life until she died. Like I said, it wasn't illegal, but it was highly frowned upon, and they didn't want her to do it anymore. All of her accomplices, you know, I said that she had like 4 servants that worked with her to accomplish this awful stuff. They were tried and you know. The Axeman of New Orleans. The Axeman of New Orleans was an unidentified serial killer who was active in like 1918 and 1919, and he killed at least 6 people. Obviously, he lived in New Orleans, which is rough in itself, but he also injured at least 6 more people, or at least somebody did. Copycat killers are a thing. This is another guy that was probably just evil for the sake of being evil. He would go to his victims' back doors. He would chisel out a little panel so he could basically open the door, find an axe in their home or a straight razor sometimes, and then he would chop his victims up. He would do this at night while they were sleeping, which is just so much worse in my mind. At least give them a chance to fight back. Now, he might have been evil for the sake of being evil, or he might have had a motive, and that motive was that he hated Italian Americans. Almost every single one of his victims were Italian immigrants or Italian Americans, so there's kind of a pattern there. There's also the Italian mob or mafia, so you could imagine that it might be a mafia hit on some members or something like that, or somebody that the mafia did wrong. We really don't know. This dude was absolutely brutal. He would take these axes and just go as hard as he possibly could on these poor people. Sometimes he would, you know, Chinese necktie some of these people as well. Here's the thing, he never stole anything from the crime scenes. Normally when somebody breaks in somebody's back door, they're going in there to try to, you know, rob them, try to get something worth value, but not this guy. He was just chopping them up. All right, so the last confirmed killing was in October of 1919. The chief suspect was a guy named Frank Mumphrey. Now, this guy owned a jazz business, so he would like put on jazz concerts or have people play jazz concerts, stuff like that. That's a big thing in New Orleans still to this day even. The thing is, in peace times when nobody was scared of anything, nobody was caring that much about the music, but whenever they were scared they were gonna go home and get their throats cut or chopped up, they would go to jazz concerts. His business was absolutely booming during this year to year and a half that the killings were going on. There was a whole legend about this Mumphrey guy that he was part of like an anti-Italian American gang, like they would go and blackmail them and kill them, stuff like that. We don't know that he was the Axeman, and I'm not going to try to slander this man's name because we really don't know, but he's pretty much the only suspect that we still talk about today, so maybe he was. Peter Stump. This was a guy that lived during the 1500s in Germany. He was a farmer, but he was also accused of being a serial killer and also like a werewolf and cannibal and just some crazy stuff. It's said that this guy killed at least 14 children and 2 pregnant women with the possibility of there being more. I think I've said that after every single serial killer. There's possibly more or less because we really don't know. Now, like I said, this guy was also accused of being a werewolf because that just makes sense in 1500s Germany. All right, so this guy supposedly started killing people in around 1569. He did this for like 25 years until his legend around that area grew. Like everybody knew he was doing this stuff. Eventually, they captured him and tortured him and put him on a werewolf trial. He confessed to have been performing black magic since he was 12. This makes sense because for those 25 years, he would apparently bleed out goats and sheep and lambs and stuff like that and drink their blood. Now, no, he was not a werewolf or anything like that, but he probably thought he was because he was crazy. He would also capture and kill children and women. After that, he would eat them. He even consumed parts of these pregnant women and what they were carrying, so just Blah. He even confessed to taking his son out into the woods and, you know, killing him and eating him because he was a werewolf. As you can imagine, after this werewolf trial, the people of Germany went hard. He died very painfully, which in my opinion he deserved. If all this mess was true, I'm not going to say anybody deserves a painful death, but in this case, the Bloody Benders. This was a family of serial killers that was active in Kansas during 1871 and 1872. The family consisted of John Bender Sr., John Bender Jr., Kate Bender Sr., and Kate Bender Jr. They were confirmed to have killed at least 11 people, but probably more than that. Alright, so they owned a little general store, so kind of like a convenience store, but also it had a little inn in the back. Back in those days, weary travelers would stay pretty much anywhere that there was a bed, so they had this option for them to stay there. The front part of this building was the store, but it also had a kitchen and a dining room, and it was all separated by a curtain from the little inn part with a bed and whatever. People's descriptions of this family and these family members was absolutely terrible. Like, people that actually met them thought that they were horrible people. The woman was a Dutch crone. The man was old, dirty, loud, ill-tempered, just awful people. Alright, so here's how they actually did it. For one, they wouldn't allow groups of people to stay at this inn. They would only allow like solo travelers. These solo travelers would be seated at a guest of honor at that dining table in the front part of their store. Remember I said this place was separated by a curtain? Well, the guests would have their back to this curtain. One of the family members would come up from behind them and bash them in the head so they were just laying out there in their chair like this. And then when they were laying out there in their chair like this, a trap door from the bottom would open up and they would fall down in a pit. After that, somebody would go down there and slit their throat or do whatever they did to them. They would go out there to their little orchard that was on this property and bury the bodies, and they would rob all the stuff off these bodies. They wanted the stuff. That was their main motive, I guess. They were able to get away with having all this stuff from these people because they would say that these people had no other way to pay for their night at the inn, so they just paid them with goods. They were eventually found out whenever people figured out that weird stuff was going on. People were literally disappearing, so investigators looked, and there were bodies buried in that orchard. Apparently, I messed up my light whenever I was doing all this, so I fixed it. But anyway, this family got wind that they were being investigated. People were figuring out what happened, and they fled town. They put a $5,000 reward on this family's head, which was a lot for back in the day, but nobody was ever officially arrested or tried or anything. I think somebody was taken in, and they claimed that she was the old woman from the family, but she probably wasn't. It's one of those great mysteries, and they probably have descendants out there among us now that nobody ever knows their secrets. Or maybe they do know their secrets, and maybe they still do it, but probably not. Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton was an English serial killer that lived during the mid-1800s. She was one of the deadliest arsenic poisoners of all time. We talked about a woman earlier that was kind of like a black widow that would kill her husbands for their life insurance policies. Well, this woman did the same thing for her husbands and 11 of her 13 children. All right, so this woman had 4 confirmed husbands. Her first one died of an intestinal disorder. She got a life insurance policy payout from him. So her and her first husband had 5 children. 4 out of the 5 kids they had died of some sort of fever or sickness, and she collected life insurance policy payouts from all of them. Her second husband, same story. He got sick and died, and she got the insurance money. All their kids died. It was awful stuff. Her 4th husband was kind of the same story. Her 3rd one was different. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Her 4th one, she was desperate for a man because nobody was taking care of her after her 3rd. Like I said, we're going to talk about that in just a second. But her sister introduced her to this man. He had lost his wife and some children. It was just a really bad situation. Well, they talked and whatever. Her sister actually acted as a mother to his kids, like a substitute. And then all of a sudden, after Mary Ann was introduced into this situation, her sister Margaret ended up dying of, intestinal stuff, fever, bad stuff. I wonder how that happened. Now, this guy, like I said, also had 2 sons. Like a year later, he has another kid with Mary Ann. Not long after, all of these kids would die, as would the husband. She would even have 2 lovers after that she would convince to put their life insurance policies in her name despite not being married to them, and they would both die, and she would collect the insurance money. Now, let's talk about that 3rd husband for a second. This was a guy named James Robinson, and he was smarter than these other guys apparently. James's first wife died, and he hired Mary Ann to come in and take care of his kids. A month after she started coming over there, his baby from his first wife died of a fever. What'd he do after that? He knocked up Mary Ann, just like the rest of these guys. Then Mary Ann's mom got ill, so she went to take care of her or whatever, and then her mom ended up dying of a gastric fever. Not long after that, whenever she was back living with James, her daughter and 2 of his sons died of fevers. You cannot make this up, how awful this woman was. They had 2 more children, and both of them died within like a month of being born. Around that time, she kept insisting that James take out a life insurance policy and put it in her name. He found out that she was running up debt and stuff like that. She was stealing money, so he was really skeptical of her and what she was doing. He also found out that she had been forcing his oldest son to pawn off his stuff so that she could have the money. He threw her out. He was done with her, and that's how she ended up with that 4th husband and then those 2 other lovers. This was a horrible, horrible black widow of a woman. The authorities eventually caught up to what she was doing because they discovered that she murdered her stepson, like the Cotton dude. I say the Cotton dude. There were so many people that she murdered, I can't even keep track of it anymore. Anyway, she was hanged, but the rope was too short, so she didn't have enough force to go snap her neck or whatever, so she died of strangulation, which is very painful. But for this woman who killed 13 kids and 4 husbands, she deserved it. All right, let's move on to tier 3. Peter Curtin. This was a German guy that was active in the early 1900s. Besides his normal name, he had 2 nicknames, the Dusseldorf Monster and the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Now, given that second one, you can probably imagine what his MO was. He would murder people and drink their blood. That's not all he did, though. It's said that this guy would get his rocks off by doing this. He really, really, really enjoyed this violence. He enjoyed killing people. He enjoyed drinking their blood, and he would literally... I'm not going there. He has 9 confirmed murders, but it's suspected that he killed 68 people, which is crazy. Now, this guy's kind of got one of your typical bad guy, feel bad for him type backstory. He was raised in a very poor home with 2 alcoholic parents and an abusive father. When this guy was only 5 years old, he tried to drown one of his playmates, like somebody that he was playing with on a playground or something. He also committed what became known as the #1 staple activity of the childhood of a serial killer. He would torture animals. This is horrible, horrible stuff. He also did pretty much any other crime you can imagine, like arson, fraud, you name it, he probably did it. He was even into bestiality, which, imagine that. I mean, this guy's pretty much the loserest loser of all losers. All right, so he was doing all this stuff. He was killing people and becoming the vampire of Dusseldorf during the late 1920s. And then in the year 1930, he took advantage of a girl and somehow, for some reason, he let her go. And she wrote a letter to her friend, but she addressed it wrong. In this letter, she detailed everything that he did to her, but because she mislabeled the address on the envelope, it went to the police instead of anybody else because there was no actual place for the letter to go. They read the contents, they interviewed her, and then they were eventually able to catch up to this guy and catch him for what he'd been doing. On July the 2nd of 1931, he was executed via guillotine, which is a fitting end, I guess. I don't even want to think about this guy anymore, but now we're going to move on to somebody else from Germany. Karl Dinke. Karl Dinke was also from Germany and also active during the early 1900s. Instead of just drinking the blood of his victims like our last guy, he was actually a cannibal. He had somewhere between 30 and 40 victims. Here's the thing about this guy. Originally, everybody thought he was a great guy. He volunteered as a cross bearer and an organist and everything else at this local church. They actually knew him as Papa Dinke. For some reason, around the turn of the century, kind of around 1903, so I guess 3 years after the turn of the century, but anyway, he started murdering like vagrant people that were moving through the area, poor people, stuff like that. He quit working for that church around this time and he got a license to sell like food, goods, and stuff, a vending license. He would sell handmade leather goods and also meat products. You can imagine where this is going. He would sell pickled meat, boneless pork. He would sell belts and leather stuff that was obviously made out of human skin. And this boneless meat was human meat, even though it was boneless pork. You know, it wasn't pork. So like I said, this guy would prey upon the homeless people. He would murder them with an axe, like he would hit them in the head. That's actually how he was caught. He lured this guy named Vincent Olivier into his home with the promise of money in exchange for him writing a letter or something like that. But anyway, he hit him in the head with an axe, but the guy got away. He didn't die like most everybody else. I guess everybody else, actually. This guy was able to alert the authorities that this guy had just tried to kill him, and while the police originally didn't believe him because he was just like a homeless guy, they eventually went and investigated it. When they did, they found all this awful stuff. They found all the leather products he had. They found drums full of human remains. Literally, it was just awful stuff. This guy was truly a cannibal. The police brought in Dinke for questioning. They placed him in a holding cell, and they went to go investigate his house and stuff like that, and they came back and he had hung himself. This story tells me that you just really never know what's going on in somebody's house until you see it for yourself. Thomas Neil Cream. This was a guy that was born in Scotland, but he was active in his activities in Scotland, Canada, America, pretty much everywhere he was. Here's the thing. He was a doctor, like an actual medical doctor during the late 1800s. He was a poisoner. He murdered at least 10 people altogether in these 3 countries. Most of his victims were lower class women. Some were like sex workers or prostitutes, whatever you want to call them. And some were even pregnant women that were wanting to get rid of their child. He actually used a chemical that's used as a pesticide as a way of getting rid of these people. I guess in a way he made this the ultimate pesticide because these people were pests to him, apparently. His first victim was a woman that he knocked up out of wedlock, and he was going to try to do an abortion or something on her, but it didn't work. So he just, I don't know, he actually left. He didn't murder this woman, but he botched an abortion. It was a whole bad thing. He was a doctor, but he wasn't a very good one, apparently. Now, that first deal was in Canada, but then after that, he moved to Chicago, Illinois. He set up his medical practice not far from the red light district, so, you know, if you know, you know. But anyway, he offered abortions and stuff like that to sex workers. He killed 4 or 5 women during his time there. He apparently hated this population, even though he wanted to work for them. I don't know. He was just a terrible person. The police caught up to him here, and they actually sentenced him to life imprisonment, but somehow they got bribed or something happened. But anyway, he ended up back in England. Once he went back to England, he did the same thing over and over again. Like at least 3 more times he killed lower class women. Eventually, the police caught up to him. He was hanged on the 15th of November in 1892. Jesse Pomeroy. Jesse Pomeroy lived in the late 1800s through the early 1900s. He was a killer, yes, but he was more of a torturer than anything. He only killed for sure 2 people, but he tortured up to like 10. This guy lived in and was active in Massachusetts at the time. He started doing this at the early age of 12 years old, and that's crazy. Most of his victims victims were also young boys, so everything that he did, pretty much because he spent his adult life in jail, we'll talk about that in a second, but anyway, most of the stuff he did, he was a juvenile, he did it to younger boys. He would take these young boys out somewhere that nobody would see them, he would strip them down, and he would just beat them. He would even attempt to kind of mutilate them, if you know what I'm saying, like genital mutilation. So he went to a sort of rehabilitation camp around the age of like 12 or 13, and then when he got back, that's when he murdered the 2 people that he murdered. He was terrible at hiding the bodies. He pretty much just didn't care what anybody thought, so whenever somebody found these bodies, he was put on actual trial. He was tried and convicted as a juvenile of these murders and these torturing, murder in the first degree actually. He was sentenced to death, but they didn't actually go through with it because the governor of Massachusetts at the time didn't sign off on the death warrant. So basically he spent the rest of his life in jail. He tried to escape from jail like 12 times. One time he even blew his eye off because he used like a gas pipe, like he took it loose and tried to blow out the side of his cell so he could escape, but it didn't work. In the late 1920s, he was moved to a home for old people that couldn't really get around in normal prison anymore, and he died there a few years later. What a life. Thug Behram. This was a guy that was known as the king of the thugs, and he was from India. He was born in the late 1700s and active during the early 1800s. He was part of a cult literally known as the Thuggy cult. It's kind of crazy that that's an actual thing. That might be where we get the term thug from now. I really don't know. Now, it's confirmed that this guy killed hundreds of people, with him claiming up to 931, which is crazy. Here's what this thug guy would do. He would be with his cult and they would travel with victims. Apparently people just traveled on foot across the country back then in India. But anyway, they would travel with them for days, and then eventually they would take this thing called a rumal. This rumal was like a ceremonial handkerchief. But anyway, that's when they would strangle their victims, and that's how they got rid of 931 people. They would basically make their victims let their guard down, like they just thought they were fellow travelers and they traveled with them in packs. This thuggy cult worshipped the Hindu god of death, so basically what they thought their purpose in life was to kill people, cause death. Now, since India was a colony of Britain at the time, the British authorities launched a huge investigation into this gang activity. I don't know if they rounded up all of them, but they caught this guy named Thug Behram and they executed him. Some of this stuff in history is absolutely crazy to me because, like, how was that real? Speaking of that, listen to this name of this next one. The Servant Girl Annihilator. Who comes up with this stuff? This was a serial killer that was active between the years 1884 and 1885, literally for just 1 year. This guy killed 7 women and 1 man in Austin, Texas. Alright, so this guy would literally break into his victims' homes and attack them in their beds while they were sleeping. Some of these women were dragged outside while they were still alive, but they were killed outside for some reason. Now, who knows why people do these weird things? Now, here's the thing. Some of these victims were like middle-class women in Texas at the time. As a result, the general population believed that it might have been their husbands that did it. One of their husbands was actually convicted of the murder because they said he had a bad temper and he always said he would kill his wife if she cheated on him or something. But anyway, the conviction was eventually overturned because he didn't do it. Now, nobody knows exactly who did this. There was even a crazy theory that this might have been Jack the Ripper before Jack the Ripper started practicing in London, but it probably wasn't him. There was a guy named Nathan Elgin. This guy's timeline was very similar to that of the murders and when they stopped, because he was shot and killed by police right after the last murder. And there were no more murders after that, obviously. It's thought because he was missing a little toe, and there was a little toe that was thought to have been left behind by the attacker, that this might have been him, but nobody really knows. This was like 150 years ago. So with that one out of the way, let's move on to tier 4. Catherine Monvoisin, aka La Voisin. This was a woman that was active during the 1600s in France, and she was actually a member of the court, kind of. She was basically a French fortune teller and midwife and dealer in all things weird. She became involved with the aristocracy and what is known as the Affair of the Poisons. This was a major scandal in King Louis XIV's court. Basically, a bunch of people were accused of poisoning other people and witchcraft and other weird stuff. Now, before all that was going on, she was just a midwife. She served as a midwife, and that led to her doing abortions and other really weird stuff. With her connections as a midwife and as a provider of poisons and stuff, she would start providing these poisons to wives of prominent members of the court. Stuff like arsenic and nightshade and other common poisons to these people back in the day. Apparently, she made a lot of money doing this because she was intertwined with the aristocracy. Louis XIV's court started looking into these poisonings and who was providing all these women with their their poison, and as a result, she was caught. She was tried and convicted, and she was burned at the stake for witchcraft. I don't know how many first-hand murders she actually committed, like how many times she actually poisoned somebody herself, but her actions led to the deaths of tons of people. Delphine Lalaurie. Alright, this woman was a part of the New Orleans aristocracy in the early 1800s. Alright, so keep in mind that back during this time in Louisiana, this was not part of America. It was actually part of Spain and then I think France for a little bit. But anyway, let's move on. This woman had tons and tons of slaves that she would torture and kill. In 1834, authorities responded to a massive fire that had broken out in her mansion. What they found was a 70-year-old woman's slave that was chained up to the kitchen while this fire was in the kitchen, and the fire was actually started by this woman so she could get away. But anyway, during this fire, this Lalaurie woman was gathering her furniture trying to save that rather than her slave that was sitting there burning up. That's an immediate red flag, but authorities found this slave woman and she led them up the stairs into the attic, and there were 7 more tied up with like iron collars on them. What a horrible person, first of all. Up there in that attic, it was literally a torture chamber. She would torture these slaves until basically they died. It was horrible stuff. You would think back then that nobody would really care what a wealthy aristocrat from Louisiana would do with their slaves, but as the masses figured out what she did, they basically held massive riots because the police didn't actually do anything to her, and she was eventually forced to flee the country altogether. She never faced any sort of legal consequences. She just fled to Paris, France, and lived there for another 15 years until she eventually passed away. History is terrible, man. I'm telling you, it's awful. William Burke and William Hare. William Squared were a pair of murderers that were very active in Scotland in the year 1828. They were confirmed to have killed at least 16 people. The pair started out as grave robbers. Here's why they started doing this. Scottish law was changed at this time so that the only bodies that could be used for medical research were those that died in prison or by, offing themselves, or as like infants or orphans, stuff like that. This basically meant that there was a shortage of corpses for medical research studies. So these two, being early entrepreneurs, would go snatch bodies from graves and sell them to medical researchers. This then escalated from them robbing graves for bodies to actually ending people's lives and selling those dead bodies to medical researchers. And how they didn't figure this out sooner, I don't know. Here's the thing, they weren't just killing random people. William Hare owned a lodging house, or basically like an inn or an apartment, something like that. Their very first sale was whenever somebody died in that lodging house, they just sold that body to the researcher, or the surgeon, I think he was. They got to thinking and they're like, we could do this more often. Somebody got sick and was basically dying in that lodging house, and they just took it upon themselves to end their life and take them over there to that surgeon. They kept doing this and they kept ending other people's lives until it escalated to like 16 people, and then they were found out. Their very last victim was a woman named Margaret Docherty. They suffocated her, and the other lodgers in that little lodging house found the body. They turned it into police, and the police started their investigation. William Hare was offered immunity if he would turn on William Burke and tell him about everything that they'd been doing, and they did that. Burke was convicted and sentenced to death, but Hare got off. So Hare got off, but there were massive riots in the town because they didn't want him to get off. Police had to escort him out of town, and he eventually went over the English border and was never seen or heard from ever again. It was a whole thing back then. Anton Probst. This was a guy that was only known to have committed 1 murder. This murder happened to be an entire family and 2 more people though, so it was technically 8 murders, I guess. Anton was a German immigrant that was in the United States working as a handyman for the Deering family. On April the 7th of 1866, he lured each and every member of the Deering family into their barn and subsequently axe murdered them. He used a hammer or an axe, but then he would basically kill them, hide their bodies under the hay, and then lead another one out there into the barn. He killed them all, then he ransacked their house, basically found everything that they had that was of any value at all, and then fled. The family's bodies were eventually found by the police, and it was pretty obvious who did it. During the investigation, the police went into this dude's house and he found all of their possessions, so it was obviously him, and then he eventually confessed to the murders and was hanged. His confession was horrifying though. He basically said he murdered one of the boys for some reason or another. There was really no good reason, but after that, he didn't care how many there were, who they were. He was going to kill everybody and get all their money, all their possessions, everything. It was almost like he was possessed or something. Sarah Jane Robinson. Sarah Jane Robinson was born in Ireland but eventually immigrated to America. Everything she did in Boston, Massachusetts during the 1880s. She poisoned members of her family as well as other close community members, and it was at least 8 people, probably more. Like some of the other women on this list, she also committed insurance fraud. She would basically poison these people with arsenic or whatever she poisoned them with and then collect the insurance policies. She poisoned her landlord first, then she poisoned her sister, her brother-in-law, her husband, and some of her kids even. She was evil. She was eventually found out and convicted of murder and sentenced to death, but she ended up serving a life sentence out in prison and died in prison. The Patty Cannon Gang. Patty Cannon was a woman that served as the leader of this Patty Cannon gang in early America. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, she led this gang of human traffickers and illegal slave traffickers and serial killers. Basically, everything she did could be known as the reverse Underground Railroad. Like, they would literally illegally traffic slaves. It was the opposite of the Underground Railroad. They would capture freed slaves that were legally not under anybody, and they would sell them back into slavery. The gang also murdered random travelers along the way, and they would just dispose of their bodies right then and there. They didn't care. Her gang was eventually caught and tried for these crimes, for all these murders, for these slave trafficking, all that kind of stuff. While she was waiting for her trial, she actually died in prison. It was officially ruled that she took some poison and ended her own life, but nobody knows for sure if that was exactly what happened or not. But either way, it doesn't really matter. She's gone. All right, now let's move on to tier 5. Tier 5 is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more ancient cases and like folk legends of ancient serial killers. We'll start this out with the Locusta of Gaul. During the 1st century AD, or basically the 1st century of the Roman Empire, this woman was a notorious poison maker. Supposedly, she actually took part in the murders of the emperors Claudius and Britannicus, and she was a favorite of Emperor Nero. She was basically a serial killer for hire. So as I said, she probably took part in Claudius's murder. Agrippina, which was Nero's mother, commissioned her to help her poison her husband, the Emperor Claudius, so Nero could be on the throne. As we know, that did happen. I think I mentioned Britannicus as an emperor. He wasn't an actual emperor. He was the son of Claudius, and he was like the rightful heir of the throne, but then Nero got placed above him on the hierarchy. But anyway, we're not talking about that. This woman poisoned a lot of important people. Nero had her poisoning people all the time. She was basically invulnerable whenever Nero was emperor, but after he took his own life, it went downhill for her. The new emperor decided to have her basically dragged through the streets of Rome and executed, and she was gone. Leo Pingley. This was one of the first ever documented serial killers from ancient China. He was a prince of the Han dynasty during the 2nd century BC, and he was very, very evil. He has over 100 documented kills to his name. Basically, he had a lot of money and a lot of land and basically a lot of everything, so he thought he could just do what he wanted, and he did. He recruited basically a gang of like 20 or 30 people to go around with him and just maraud, just do terrible things to everybody around, just terrorize people. They were basically recreational killers. He literally killed over 100 people indiscriminately, so like regular villagers, peasants, travelers, anybody he came upon, he just killed. Everybody in that gang did. They were evil. A family member of one of his victims spoke up and told like the rest of the aristocracy of that era that he was doing these things. Instead of killing him or just killing the villager or something like that, the people at the top actually stripped this guy of his noble status, and he was just basically made a commoner. After that, nobody really heard from him again. Emperor Caligula. This guy Caligula was an emperor of Rome from the year 37 to 41, so he was one of the first emperors, really. Basically, he was seen as a good ruler at first, but then as the years went on, and apparently he had some kind of really bad sickness, he got evil, basically. He was one of the most cruel rulers of all time. He would force some of his political rivals to just take their own life. He would execute people that forgot his birthday. He would have children executed, and he would have their parents watch them. He was quoted as having said basically that he could do whatever he wanted, so he would just kill as many people as he wanted to. Now, it's said that this guy might have actually been insane, but if he was just insane or not, we don't know. He was most likely just a psychopath. When somebody's born into having that much power, it just exemplifies what they really are as a person. So if you start as an evil-natured person and then you give that evil-natured person unlimited power, unlimited resources, unlimited everything, total immunity from the law, it's just going to make them exponentially more evil because more of that comes out. He thought of himself as a god, and he eventually paid for it. He was assassinated by some of his own Praetorian Guard members. Dude was an absolute menace, so he kind of got what was coming to him, but at the same time, his wife and young daughter were also killed, so that's sad. But anyway, Phalaris of Acragas. This guy was a tyrant on the island of Sicily in the 6th century BC. It's unknown exactly exactly how many people he killed, but he had tons of executions held. These were no ordinary executions though. He used this torture mechanism known as the brazen bull. Legend has it that this thing was a life-size bull made completely out of bronze. It was hollowed out and it had a door on one side that people were stuffed in whenever they were condemned. They would then light a fire under it and they were literally boiled alive. Apparently it was designed so that the acoustics, like the sound and stuff, came out of the bull's nose and it sounded like a bull bellowing. That's just terrifying. Now this guy Phalaris was said to enjoy these executions, like he enjoyed hearing this bull bellow whenever this stuff happened. Apparently he had political enemies executed, he had just people he didn't like executed, basically anybody that he didn't like a little bit, he just throw him in this bull. This whole story is kind of conjecture, like some people think it was just legend, but if it was real, this guy was a true serial killer. Now we'll talk about tier 6, which is similar to tier 5, but a little bit deeper. The all-female Roman poison ring. This was quite literally an all-female poisoning ring that was active in 331 BC. It said that high-class aristocrat Roman women would poison their men, and it was just a horrible thing. A bunch of them just murdered their husbands. It was basically a giant conspiracy to get rid of their husbands, and nobody really knows why, but anyway, they rounded them all up and they were basically taken care of. Eusebius Pierre Dagnel. I probably didn't say that right, but he was a French serial killer during the 1800s. He was confirmed to have killed 6 girls. This guy worked as a butcher's assistant, so you can imagine that anybody that wanted to do that was probably a little bit crazy in the head. Apparently he became aroused by blood. He became famous because he gave a long monologue before the jury before his death. He confessed to everything he did and some that he probably didn't even do. He was convicted of the murders that he confessed to and executed right then and there. Not that much is known about him other than the fact that he was crazy. Mary Bateman, aka the Yorkshire Witch. Mary Bateman was a murderer from Yorkshire, England that was active in the early part of the 1800s. It's not known how many people she killed, but she did a lot of poisoning. She became a fortune teller and con artist and poisoner, witch, stuff like that. That's why she was known as the Yorkshire Witch. She was the type to sell charms and poisons and do all that crazy black magic type stuff. She was convicted of the murder of at least one woman, as well as the fact that she was kind of being witch hunted, but anyway, she was hung in 1809. Queen Anula. This was one of the first queens of Sri Lanka around 40 BC. Like old Mary, she was also a poisoner. It said that she would poison her husbands so that she could stay on the throne. As I said, she was pretty much the first queen of Sri Lanka. There's a reason for that, because it was always a king, but then she poisoned her husband who was the king. She subsequently poisoned basically every man she married so that she could stay on the throne. She even poisoned her son so that the king didn't take over. Somebody finally figured out what was going on. They held a coup basically against her and burned her. Her reign was over and another king took over after she left. I have no problem with the queen, but whenever you have to murder your husband to get there, that's not okay. The Red Inn murderers. Kind of like one of the cases we talked about earlier, this was a pair of murderers who owned an inn. As weary travelers would walk in the door, they would have their guard down, they would stay in their inn, and they would be executed summarily by these French people. This took place in the early 1800s. They would basically lure these travelers in there, they would murder them, they would take all their money and possessions, sell them, and they would just accumulate a fortune. They would eventually get found out and summarily executed via guillotine because they were in France and everybody in France died of a guillotine. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, hit that subscribe button. I really enjoyed this special and the last one. This Halloween season has been awesome for me. Going forward, it would mean a lot to me if you would watch this next video, The Ancient Horrors Iceberg. It's pretty similar to this video, but it's not really about killers, it's about creepy stuff from the ancient world. Until next time, remember that if you try to stay in an inn that's owned by a man and a woman and there's only 1 or 2 bedrooms in that entire place, you might want to keep on rolling, maybe sleep on the side of the road or something. See you in the next one. Peace.